DIY aged vessels turn cheap thrift finds into expensive-looking antique decor. What if that ugly thrift store vase sitting on a shelf for $5 could actually look like something from a high-end designer showroom? Not after replacing it, not after spending hundreds of dollars. With a little paint, texture, and one surprisingly simple aging technique, you can make an ordinary vessel look like it has been sitting in an old European home for decades. And the best part is that you don't need to be an expert at DIY. You actually want the finish to look imperfect. Because when it comes to faux antique decor, the little cracks, uneven patches, dark edges, and random layers are exactly what make the piece feel authentic. Today, we're taking a few inexpensive vessels and transforming them into earthy, weathered pieces that look far more expensive than they really are. But there's an important trick behind the whole process, and it has less to do with the paint color than you might think. It starts with choosing the right piece. When you're walking through a thrift store, don't only look at what an object looks like right now, look at its shape. A strange ceramic container, an outdated planter, or an old decorative jar might look completely unremarkable under its original finish. But imagine that same shape covered in a chalky, aged surface with darker tones settled into the details. Suddenly, it can look completely different. That's the first secret to a convincing thrift flip. Don't try to make a cheap object look new. Make it look old. For the first transformation, imagine finding a small ceramic container with a shape that feels more like an antique urn than a modern kitchen accessory. The original finish doesn't matter much because we're going to cover most of it. Start with a matte black base coat. The reason for using matte paint is simple. A shiny surface immediately makes something look modern and manufactured. A flat finish gives us a rougher foundation and also helps the next layers grip the surface. Once the base is dry, the real transformation begins. Instead of applying another perfectly smooth coat of paint, introduce texture. A little texture is what separates an ordinary painted vase from something that looks weathered by time. You can use a suitable texture compound or a similar decorative medium and apply it unevenly across the surface. Don't make every section identical. Dab some areas, spread others. Leave small patches thinner. Let a little of the dark base remain visible around raised details. That randomness is important. Real aging isn't symmetrical. Dirt doesn't collect evenly. Paint doesn't wear away in perfect patterns. Decades of handling, dust, moisture, and exposure create hundreds of tiny variations. So instead of trying to paint an antique effect perfectly, you're trying to recreate that randomness. Once the texture has dried, introduce a warm, earthy shade. A muted brown or taupe works beautifully because it resembles the colors naturally associated with soil, clay, and aged materials. Use a damp cloth or sponge and lightly dab the color onto selected areas. Don't cover everything. The goal is to build layers. Dark underneath, muted color above it, texture breaking through, then another subtle shade in certain areas. Suddenly, the surface begins to have depth, and here's a detail that can make a huge difference. Concentrate some of the darker color toward the bottom. Think about where dirt would naturally accumulate if a vessel had been sitting outdoors or on an old stone floor for years. The lower portion should generally feel heavier and more grounded than the upper section, but keep the transition soft. You don't want a straight line that announces, "I painted the bottom darker." You want the eye to believe the color simply developed there over time. Now look at the decorative details. If the vessel has ridges, grooves, handles, or raised patterns, don't cover them completely. Let darker tones settle into those recesses, while lighter tones remain on the raised areas. This creates instant dimension. And that contrast can make a simple thrift store piece look surprisingly sophisticated. The second technique takes a completely different approach. Instead of starting with a dark vessel, begin with something whose shape is great, but whose color is completely wrong for your room. Maybe it's too orange. Maybe it's too pink. Maybe it has a glossy finish that makes it look inexpensive. Don't automatically reject it. Color can be changed. Shape is much harder to change. For this piece, apply a thin layer of joint compound or another suitable texture medium. You don't need a thick, perfectly smooth coating. In fact, a slightly uneven surface is exactly what we're after. While the material is still workable, gently pat the surface to create subtle irregularities. You want the finished vessel to feel tactile. Once it dries, cover it with a muted mineral or stone-like base color. Now comes the part that makes the technique surprisingly forgiving. Use a damp cloth to apply 2 or 3 earthy colors in small patches. One can be light, another can be warm brown, a third can sit somewhere in between. Dab, blend, soften. Repeat. If one section becomes too dark, don't panic. Add a little of the lighter color. If a transition looks too sharp, use a damp cloth to soften it. You're not trying to produce a perfect painted pattern. You're creating the visual suggestion of age, and the texture underneath does much of the work for you. The paint settles into the uneven surface, creating tiny variations that would be difficult to reproduce on a completely smooth vase. This is why texture matters so much. Without texture, you are basically painting a picture of an old vessel. With texture, light actually interacts with the surface like it would on a naturally weathered object. And that's what makes the result more convincing. But there's another technique that can create an entirely different look. For a darker, more dramatic vessel, begin again with a matte black base. Then mix a muted earthy paint with a little baking soda or another suitable texturing ingredient. The goal isn't to create a thick plaster coating. You're simply giving the paint more body and a slightly mineral, chalky appearance. Apply it unevenly. Let some of the black show through. Then begin layering additional shades with a damp cloth. This is where you should resist the temptation to overthink it. There isn't one perfect pattern. Some areas can be darker, some can be lighter. Some can show the black underneath. Blend until the colors begin to look like they belong together. The more layers you build, the less obvious the individual paint applications become. And that is exactly what you want. Because an authentic-looking aged surface doesn't look like it came from one can of paint. It looks like dozens of subtle changes happened over time. Then comes one of the most important visual tricks. Exaggerate the recessed areas. If your vessel has grooves or ridges, work a darker earthy color into those spaces. Then soften the edges with a damp cloth. The darker pigment remains in the recesses, while the raised areas stay lighter. Instant depth, instant age. And suddenly, a relatively ordinary planter can start looking like something you'd expect to find in a rustic Mediterranean garden. Now let's go bigger. A large outdoor planter can be especially impressive because scale changes the entire effect. A small vase might become a decorative accent. A large planter can completely change the appearance of a room. Start with an earthy base color and add texture to the paint if desired. Just keep in mind that some sealers can add a slight sheen, and shine can work against the aged effect. If the vessel is purely decorative and won't be touched much, you may not need as much protection. Finally, place the finished piece in your space. And this is where the transformation becomes especially satisfying. A cheap thrift store find is no longer just an old container. It becomes part of the room. Pair it with a modern table. Place it beside a vintage frame. Add branches, dried stems, or an olive tree. Mix it with newer furniture. That's where aged decor really comes alive. The goal isn't to make your entire home look old. It's to create contrast. New beside old, smooth beside rough, clean beside weathered, modern beside timeless. That contrast is what gives a room depth. And maybe that's the biggest lesson behind this entire DIY. You don't always need expensive decor to create an expensive-looking space. Sometimes the most interesting piece is hiding underneath a finish you don't like, sitting on a thrift store shelf that everyone else walked past. All you need to do is see what it could become. So the next time you find an inexpensive vase, planter, jar, or unusual ceramic piece, don't ask yourself, "Do I like this?" Ask a different question. Could I make this look completely different? Because with the right shape, a few earthy layers, some imperfect texture, and a little patience, that forgotten thrift store object might end up looking like the piece that gives your entire room character. And the best part? Nobody has to know how little you actually paid for it.